Hi everyone. In this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at another chess opening, and this is the Sicilian defense, the Maroczy bind, and it's about the 7th move sidelines. White starts out by playing e4 and black goes c5. Knight f3, g6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight c6, and c4. So we have the Maroczy bind. Black develops the knight out to f6, white defends the e4 pawn by going knight c3, and now d6 by black. And this is all pretty familiar. If you remember from my last two Maroczy bind videos, then you definitely have seen this a bunch of times. And here, white has a couple of options. Usually the main moves are going to be bishop to e2 and developing accordingly, whether it be bishop to e3 and then queen d2, or just bishop g5 and then queen d2 and castle, etc., etc. But in this case, white is going to go for a different move other than bishop to e2. Instead, white has three choices. There is either the option of going bishop to e3, there is knight c2, and there's also f3. And we're first going to be taking a look at f3, and if f3 is played, then black will just trade the knights and develop the bishop. So obviously, black is not threatening any discoveries at the moment, but if given some time, black may castle, and if this bishop ever develops out to e3, and black is castled defending his bishop, then the knight can always come to g4 and attack the bishop on e3, which is always a very good attacking piece in many different Sicilian variations, so that would be beneficial for black. White does indeed bring the bishop out to e3, and black will just castle. Queen to d2, and now a5. And the idea of this a5 move is just to try controlling space and avoiding queenside expansions with something like b4 on white's end. So white develops the bishop out to e2, black plays a4, controlling a bit more space. Now, of course, if b4 is played, then there's a takes b3 en passant, and the pawn on a2 is pinned. The rook goes to c1, maybe trying to encourage ideas of b3 or b4 now, and black develops the bishop out to e6, pressuring the c4 pawn. And if given time, black is definitely going to build up on the pressure, so white decides to play the move knight d5. Now, you can take with the bishop or the knight. Instead, it's better to play knight d7, which retains both pieces, and it now wants to get this knight into the c5 square. And that knight is a very powerful knight, and although you would be trading it off for white's bishop, the light squared bishop that white would have remaining would not really be very useful. So white would only have to rely on his knight in order to make any progress whatsoever. So here, white will just castle, and black goes knight c5, and white's not going to take, obviously, because first of all, you give an outpost for black on the d4 square, after takes, and secondly, you don't give up your bishop that's very good just for a knight that landed on c5. So instead, white's going to play rook fd1, and building up and defending the d5 square. Rook to e8, black moves the rook out of the way, and is preparing ideas like mainly moving the queen, but black couldn't do that in the previous variation because the pawn on e7 was hanging. So defending the pawn, now black is obviously going to try and get some counterplay on the queen side. Bishop d4, and before capturing the d4 bishop, black decides to take on d5, and now goes queen to a5, wanting to trade the queens off because the counterplay is mainly going to happen on the queen side, and with black getting all of the pieces on the queen side, it's really going to be beneficial for black. So here, rook c3. White blocks the queen trade, and now black goes for queen to b4. And now you are trying to trade the queens off with something like queen takes d4 or even bishop takes d4. But you're also trying to get a little bit closer into white's territory. White trades the bishops off and then goes queen c2. Why does white go queen c2? Well, because first of all, white does not want to trade the queens off since black is left with the superior knight to this inferior bishop. And another thing is that there's no need to trade the queens off. Just constantly build up on the c-file. And that's what white's doing. Queen c2. And now there are ideas like rook c4 to kick the queen out of the b4 square. Maybe sidestep in case this queen ever goes to b6 and is threatening any discoveries. And white is completely fine. There's nothing really that should be worrying him. So rook e c8, and now rook c4, kicking the queen back. And the queen actually goes to a5, because going to b6 would not really help black's position at all. White would just go to h1, and nothing has been achieved. So queen to a5, and now white trades the queens off, and now gets an activated bishop. If you compare the bishop on e2 previously to now, you can obviously see it has more scope than before, and it can definitely be improved. It can go to b5. You can always go rook e c1 and pin this knight on c5, and you're just building up the pressure towards this knight on c5. A3 by black, and this is a nice move. Black is trying to either damage white's pawn structure severely, or just win the pawn back and get a nice endgame, which is relatively drawn, and both sides don't really have to hope for much. b3 by white. Why do you not take the pawn? Well, if you take the pawn with your own pawn, then you get rook to a5. This rook is coming over to a8, and this pawn is going to be lost. There is no way to defend it, as this knight covers both squares on the third rank, meaning that it doesn't matter whether the rook infiltrates to d3 or to b3. In both cases, it will not be able to defend the pawn. At the same time, if you try going rook d3 now, taking advantage of this pin that white has along the c-file, then black is just going to take the rook on d3, no questions asked. And after rook takes c8, knight c5, that pawn on a3 is going to fall. This pawn on b7 is nicely secured, and with something like king to f6, black improving the king's position, white is most likely going to be the one who is worse in this endgame. So instead of taking with the pawn, and taking with the rook leads to similar variations, because you would just trade rooks and then go rook a8. So instead, white goes b3, and black tries knight a6, and this is to move the knight away and also get ideas of infiltrating to this b4 square. Now, b4 is severely weak, and if black can take advantage of that square, then that is also a plus. However, white is able to trade the rooks off and now takes the knight, just so that black doesn't activate the knight into the b4 square. And although black doesn't have anything to really prove as counterplay, neither does white, and both sides are relatively equal. So that was the move f3. Now there are two other moves that we can go over, and those are bishop to e3 and knight c2. And we're first going to be looking at bishop e3. And if bishop e3 is played, this is perhaps the one time where you're actually not going to take the knight on d4 in all of the variations. Black goes knight g4 now, and is threatening this bishop on e3. So white takes on c6, hoping that black will take back. However, that's not the case. And a problem with playing something else, like bishop to g5 and saving the bishop this way, is that black can simply go for queen b6. And now the knight on d4 is attacked, the pawn on b2 is attacked, and if you move this knight, let's say you captured the knight on c6, then there's just queen takes f2 mate. And that is the major problem with this position, and it's basically the reason why here white has to give up the bishop pair. So knight takes c6, knight takes e3, and you don't have any intermediate moves to save your queen, because either the knight will be captured or black can save their knight. So knight takes d8, knight takes d1, capturing the queen, and basically it's just trading pieces off. And here, what do you think the right move for white is? Okay, so if you thought the right move was actually just to take the pawn on f7, then you are incorrect, because black can just take the knight on c3. And you might be thinking, well, how does this help black? Because if white is greedy and is going to capture the rook on h8, then black can just take the pawn on e4. And now, the simple idea for black is to go bishop to g7 and capture the knight on h8. And white simply has no way of defending the knight. And basically, the knight will be trapped, and let's say you go rook c1, bishop g7, and now bishop e2, bishop h8. You notice now that black has a bishop and a knight against a rook. And if we cancel out all the pawns, we see that black has 6 pawns, white has 6 pawns as well. So generally, the endgame will be favorable for black. And this will just be advantages for black. So white doesn't take the pawn on f7, and instead goes for rook takes d1, just capturing the knight. Capturing the knight anyway would also just work. So black takes the knight on d8, and now white goes for one of two moves. either e5 or c5, which takes advantage of the pin that this rook on d1 is using against the king on d8. And we're first going to be looking at the move c5, and if this move is played, then bishop e6 by black. Just develop your bishop out. We'll trade a pair of pawns, and now bishop to e2, developing the light squared bishop out for white. And here, king to e7. So black gets the king out and is most likely ready to play bishop g7 and bring preferably this rook over to the c file. And the c file is the only open file for black, so black must make use of it. Now, after king e7 is played, knight d5 check, bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, and yes, white has managed to get a very active rook, but black has managed to grab the c file. And this is a crucial point in this variation of the Sicilian, because white has managed to, yes, get a lot of activity, but black has control of an entire file, and black simply uncontested. Now the idea is just to bring the bishop out to g7, maybe centralize this rook, maybe go to c6, and then bring the other rook over to c8. And slowly but surely, black's pressure exerted on white is going to build up and build up like that. So white doesn't have any real way of stopping any of this. Now, with that being said, you don't have to go for the move c5. You could instead go for e5. And if e5 is played, it comes with a similar idea. But black actually goes for an interesting decision here. And it's actually to give up the d6 pawn with bishop to g7. Now, why exactly does black do this move? Well, it turns out that even though black is going to give up a pawn, they're going to get a lot of compensation in exchange for it. So e takes d6, and now the move that really proves that white has nothing against black, even though white has an extra pawn, is bishop takes c3 check. And why is this move winning? Well, it turns out that after bc3, ed6, here white has two choices. You can either go c5, or you could take on d6 with check. Taking on d6 with check would result in king c7, and now rook d4. And here, yes, okay, you have won a pawn, but black seizes the open e-file. And black's the one that controls the open e-file, not white. And this can give a very good advantage for black in this case. Now, after rook e8 check, yes, white can defend with something like bishop e2, but black's activity will just start kicking in. Bishop e6, follow up with rook a to d8, and then you just trade the rooks off. And if you compare black's pawn structure to white's, there is clearly a difference. White has 3 isolated pawns, and black doesn't have any. So it just goes to show how weak white's position is in this case. That being said, you don't have to go rook takes d6 check, you can try c5. And the idea of c5 is to mainly play c takes d6, in which white is not really going to have a bad structure anymore, since they've gotten rid of their isolated pawn on the c file. So here after c5, black goes rook to e8 check. And if you go king to d2, then black will just take the pawn on c5, no problem there. So bishop to e2, blocking the check. And here an interesting move. If you were playing with the black pieces, what would you do here? Would you go king c7, activate the king, or maybe develop your bishop out to e6? Well, it turns out the best move is actually to go b6. And you might be thinking, how in the world does this save me if I'm playing with the black pieces? Well, because if here white were to take the pawn on d6, then black just gets a lot of counterplay after bishop to a6. And if we count the material, we see that black has 5 pawns and white has 6. So essentially, black is going to blockade this pawn from ever moving, trade all of the pieces off, win the pawn back, and then using the fact that black has a better pawn structure, black can easily convert this position. That is just one method, but there are many other ways that you can see that black is slightly better in this case. Now, instead of going c takes d6, you might also be asking yourself, why doesn't white just play c takes b6? And now after a takes b6, you simply go rook takes d6 check. Well, it turns out that black can just play a takes b6, and after check on d6, king c7, let's say you play the move rook to d2, just bishop to a6. And you're attacking the e2 bishop, And let's say you play something like king to d1. Now black can actually just trade all of the pieces off with rook e2, bishop e2, king e2, and then just take the pawn on a2. And black has gotten back the material, and it's generally an equal position, but considering the activity of black's rook, I would say that black is slightly better here. So that's why the move rook takes d6 check is going to be played instead of something like c takes d6 or c takes b6. Now after rook takes d6 check is played, here black is going to go king c7. And the point of this move is that if you play c takes b6 here, then you're not guarding your rook anymore. Black just takes the rook and they're winning. Now, what happens if you try to defend this pawn because you're being stingy and you do not want to give up any material? Well, if you go rook to d5, then simply just bishop a6 is one idea. You could also just activate the king with king c6, but the general thing to consider here is black's pieces are active and white's are not. I mean, if you compare this rook to this rook, who has an easier time of actually getting activated? It's this rook, right? It can easily come over and help its comrade with the attack, and what does white really have for it? Just a passive rook that can't really do much. So you see the comparisons between all of the pieces. Bishop a6 could work here, king c6 could work here. In any case, black would be favored over white. So rook d5 wasn't played. Instead, after this, rook d2 was played, and black takes the pawn, and it's an equal position. Just develop the bishop out when this bishop is still pinned, and you have a good game for yourself as black. So that was the move bishop e3. Now we're going to be looking at our last move, which is knight c2. This is the main variation. Now after knight c2 is played, black develops the bishop out to g7. This is the same idea we've been seeing, where you have this sort of dragon setup where you play bishop g7, d6, knight f6, and knight c6. White goes bishop to e2, developing the bishop out, and now both sides castle on the king side, knight d7, and bishop to d2. Here, black goes for the move a5, and is striking on the queen side, and is mainly preventing white from going b4, since back then, b4 was somewhat of a threat. So a5 prevents it, because now it's guarded 2 times by black and only once by white. So here, white has a couple of choices to go for. One move is knight to a3. Another move is rook to b1. Another move is bishop to e3. There's king to h1 as well, and also queen to c1. Yes, there are 5 different ways that white can play, and black's idea in all of them is pretty much the same thing. So, we're first going to be looking at the move king to h1. It's the most basic of all these moves. Now, after king to h1 is played, what does black do? Black goes for knight c5. And the idea is to take this knight on c3. Why? Because this knight on c3 has an eye towards this e4 pawn, defending it. So removing it would definitely help win you some extra material. So knowing that this pawn is about to be captured if white doesn't do anything, white's going to go for the move f3, defending the pawn. And what does black do? Well, black goes f5. Obviously, you're going to need to be creating some counter threats that your opponent is going to have trouble dealing with. And in this case, f5 definitely creates some trouble on the king side for white. And here, after f5, you're obviously looking to maybe take on e4, or if white takes on f5 himself, just bishop f5, and you have a very good game as black. Now, with that being said, white is not forced to play king to h1. You could also go bishop to e3, and if this is played, black develops the knight out to go to c5, f3, a4, and now queen to d2, as there were threats of a3. Since if you play something like king to h1 and you don't acknowledge what's happening, then a3. This is a serious threat, since this knight on c3 is only defended by this b2 pawn. Capturing this pawn on a3 may seem like you're doing something when you capture it with the knight. However, after rook takes a3, black is the one who's better. Because if you take the rook, then you lose your knight on c3, and if you play bishop takes c5, then not only could black just play dc5 and then trade the queens off, but black could even just play rook takes c3 here, and black's better. If you play bc3, for instance, just dc5. And would you look at that? Black has some extra material, and if we count the material up, we see that black has 6 pawns, and white has 7 pawns. But if the queens are traded off and this goes into an endgame, it's actually going to be favorable for black. So, now you can't go king to h1, and that means that white must defend the knight on c3 with queen d2. After queen d2, black goes queen a5. Is now still threatening this move a3, because you're still trying to break through and capture this pawn on b2, or lure it away from the defense of the c3 knight. After queen to a5, this is generally considered a good game for black, and black has a lot of counterattacking chances, and they can also just develop the bishop out to e6, maybe even go f5, and black isn't that bad here. If anyone should be favored, it should be black for the amount of development that they have, and also the amount of counter threats that they have as well. So that was the move bishop e3. There's also the option of going rook to b1, and if rook b1 is played, then you go knight c5. You're still threatening this bishop c3, and then knight e4 idea. White defends, f5, pretty standard, and now king to h1. King moves out of the way, you take on e4, and after knight takes e4, you actually just go bishop to f5. And this is because you develop your bishop out, you got it out of that very terrible square on c8, and now you're pressuring the knight on e4. Maybe if this knight even moves, you could also be thinking about capturing this knight on c2, and then infiltrating with knight to d4, something like that. And you can see how black starts to slowly but surely improve the position based on very nice piece play and nice ways of activating the pieces on their end. So, that was rook to b1. We're also going to be looking at 2 other moves, which are queen to c1, and also knight to a3. And we're going to be looking at queen c1 first. If queen c1, then I guess you already know what's going to happen by now. Knight c5, threatening the c3 knight. But here, white has a nice trick. White's going to go bishop to h6. And the idea is that now if you take the knight on c3, you obviously lose your rook on f8. And you would lose the exchange. I'm not saying that black would be completely losing in that case. There are definitely chances if you go bishop c3, but it's best advised not to play bishop takes c3 in this case. So bishop e6, black develops the bishop out, doesn't really care about the threat against the king. All good. Bishop g7, king g7, and now queen to d2. So white can develop the queen out to d2 now, and further centralize their pieces with something like rook fe1, rook ad1, place these rooks on very active squares, mainly the d1 square. You could even think of doubling the rooks later on in the game. Here black goes f6 and is trying to use this bishop as a defender of the king, and it's also trying to include more pieces, and it may even help black run with the king to f7 just in case. So king to h1, and now bishop to f7. Black's bishop is now trying to guard the king from any enemy pieces. Rook a b1, queen b6, and now f3. So reinforcing the e4 pawn, and here a4 by black. And here white decides to play the move b4. b3 was also an optional move, but b4. And b4 tries to attack this knight on c5 and displace it from the very active c5 square that it is on. So here a b3 en passant, and after a takes b3, it may seem like maybe black can actually take this pawn on b3. But it turns out that this is just a poison pawn, and if black were actually going to take this, then they are completely lost here. So, if you were playing with the white pieces, how would you punish black's play? It turns out that you're actually going to play the move rook takes b3 as white. And yes, you're going to do this with the intention of sacrificing the exchange, but you're going to get a lot more material in return for it. So after rook takes b3, you're obviously going to capture the rook, otherwise you'd be down material. However, rook to b1 now by white. And this is devastating for black because now, would you look at that, their queen is trapped on b3. Now, obviously, you can try giving up some material for the queen by playing something like bishop takes c4, but you're not going to get anywhere after this, and white is completely winning here. An easy way to convert would just be h3, getting some room for your king, and then going knight d4, trading all the pieces off. And what does black honestly have? Nothing, right? So black has no chances after that. So you don't go knight takes b3. Instead, you have to be a bit patient. Instead, rook fc8. b4, and now comes knight to a4. You want to trade the knights off. Now, after knight a4 is played, knight to d5 is going to be played by white. Obviously, grabbing some space in the center. And yes, you could take the knight on d5. That is very true. However, black is instead going to go queen d8. And this is just to defend the e7 pawn and not to immediately give up the powerful bishop that is the f7 bishop. So f4. White is going to go straight for an attack, or at least try to exchange some pieces off in their favor. And the reason why black wasn't going to take with the bishop is that, first of all, the knight would be displaced, and this knight is also a bit displaced on the a4 square. So black wants to trade the displaced knight on a4 for the powerful knight on d5, which is definitely a thing to consider. When you have a bad piece, try to see how you can exchange it for a good piece of your opponent's. That will definitely improve your play, not only in just one game, but it can help you in a general sense. So knight de3, and now rook to a2. Black takes the second rank, and is going to follow up with something like rook ca8, maybe even knight to a4. And you see how later on, all of these pieces are going to start incorporating themselves into white's territory. So, after rook to a2, this is the end of the queen c1 variation. Now, we still have one more variation to cover, and that is what happens if white goes knight to a3. Well, if knight a3 is played, black plays knight c5, yes, that very move, and now knight a b5. So why does white go knight a b5? Well, previously we saw that black was always trying to play this move bishop c3, and then follow up with knight takes c4, simply winning a pawn. Here, if you play bishop c3, then white can just take with the knight, and nothing has really changed except you've given up your very powerful dark squared bishop for a knight that wasn't really doing anything. That too, you've weakened your king side severely, and you're not even going to win any material, so it doesn't even make any sense here. So bishop c3 doesn't work. That's why knight to d4 is played here by black. Now after knight d4, here white's going to take the knight on d4. And this is because if white doesn't do anything, or if they just play something like a3, then black can take the knight on b5. Here, if you take with the knight, then you're obviously losing the e4 pawn, and if you take with the pawn, then you are getting into some trouble after bishop c3, and after bishop c3, knight e4. So, after knight d4, white is kind of forced to trade, or at least try to reinforce the pawn on e4. So, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and here, white's going to go for the move bishop to h6. Why does white do this? Well, first of all, you might be thinking, can you go back to g7 and just guard your position? Well, yes, you can go back to g7, but instead, black goes for a very nice tactical sequence. Instead, bishop c3. Why do you play bishop c3 and sacrifice the rook on f8? Well, it turns out if you actually play bishop f8 as white, bishop takes b2 by black. Black is unfazed by this move. Now you go rook to b1, for instance, bishop to f6. You just bring the bishop back so that it's not going to get harassed later on in the game. After bishop to f6, the only way to save this bishop on f8 is to go back to h6. Now, you might be thinking that you could trap the bishop and win it, but that takes a bit of time, and instead it's just better to capture this e4 pawn. Black is better here. You know, this knight is going to get activated. This bishop is coming into the game very easily. The exchange sacrifice was completely worth it, and what does white have? Absolutely nothing. And later on, this bishop can definitely be disconnected from going back to white's territory. And you can see how black starts to slowly but surely chip away white's position and gets rid of white's small advantages and makes them his own. So that's why after bishop c3 is played, you just take the bishop on c3. And although you could play knight takes e4 and take advantage of this weak pawn structure, just save the rook. Go rook e8, and now you've saved the rook. You're getting ideas of f6 to block the queen out from ever infiltrating. And you're just definitely doing a good thing here as black. White's bishop seems to be very active here, but in reality, that's not the case. And black can always use this knight very efficiently. And that too because this bishop is very off-sided, and because no pawn can actually kick the knight away from the c5 square. It's on a very powerful outpost that we can see be very efficiently used, mainly in targeting this e4 pawn, but it can also be used later on queenside expansions with something like a4 and a3. So after rook e8, that is the end of the variation. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.